Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this beautiful planet Earth. And I want to welcome you to the Seeds of Knowledge, a program, this series that is dedicated to exploring timeless spiritual principles through dialogue, reflections. This program is brought to you by Solitude Center for Spiritual Living, a spiritist group that is 100% virtual. And in today's session, we have our wonderful Peter Hayes, who will present on the topic of divine justice and responsibility. It is an inspiring talk on how the divine laws of love and justice manifest in our lives and how personal responsibility becomes a key path to our harmony and our spiritual progress. But that's all I'm going to say, Peter. I'm not going to go about the topic that you're going to explore. I just wanted to ask, hey, Peter, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Marcia?
I am good. It is so good to have you with us, Peter. And for those of you who are here and may not know Peter, let me go ahead and do a formal introduction. Sorry for that, Peter. And after I introduce you, I'll go and you have the mic.
Okay.
So, Peter Hayes has over 2 decades of dedication to the Spiritist movement. He serves currently as a director of outreach for the United States Spiritist Federation. He is an active member of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. And he has spoken at numerous national symposia, right? Or symposiums, and contributed to different programs such as Initiation to Spiritism as well as Introduction to Mediumship. But I admire Peter beyond all the work that he does through Spiritism, Spiritist uh, programs, etc. Peter brings his artistic background in theater and music to his talks, and I've seen you do this with me, Peter, many, many times, but he often weaves creativity as well as compassion and very deep knowledge of those industries, right? So also, together with the Betty Rosenkalk, I don't know how to pronounce your wife's name. I always get it wrong, but Betty,
A
right?
complicated Polish name,
Yes,
Rosenzweig.
yes,
Rosenzweig.
Rosen Sykes. Yes, pretend I said it correctly.
Okay.
But Betty is a wonderful, wonderful individual as well. And together they confounded the Sem Fronteiras Press, which is a publishing house for children's books in the U.S., Brazil, and Colombia. I think I have all your books, Peter, yours and Betty's books. I love them. But
We have
for
two brand new ones as well.
Oh,
So,
so I need to get them, right?
two.
But for those of you who are here today, I'm not going to take much longer. I will pass the mic to Peter. Peter, thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Marcia. It's a pleasure to be here. Divine justice and personal responsibility is based on the book Heaven and Hell, which is the fourth book in the Spiritist codification, published in 1865. So we're actually in the 160th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken. And this presentation focuses on the connection between divine justice and personal responsibility. So, what do we mean by divine justice? Well, there are many ways to think about divine justice. It's a very complicated and nuanced uh, process, but one way to think about it is that divine justice is the way in which our actions, whatever our actions may be, can have consequences, and that these consequences will shape our lives our spirit and shape our spiritual journey as we continue along. Really, divine justice is about cause and effect, and that divine justice helps all of us to progress in both worlds. By both worlds, I mean here on earth, in this current life that we have, but also in the spiritual world, since Spiritism strongly emphasizes a belief in the immortality of the soul and the process of reincarnation, which leads to spiritual progress. Divine justice is very connected to divine law. So, what do we mean by divine law? Well, divine law is both the physical and the moral laws. The physical laws are laws that are studied by scientists, for instance, that govern not only the planet, but the universe as a whole. And the moral laws are more in the realm of, say, religion or spirituality, philosophy, that has to do with our moral progress, our moral development. The combination of the physical and moral laws is divine law. The divine law, one way to understand divine law, is the 10 Commandments that were given to Moses. That happens, of course, in Exodus, which is the second book in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus summarized the 10 Commandments down to two essential points. The first one is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your might. And then he adds to that, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, in loving God with all of our heart, our soul, and all of our might, we're loving everything that God created. We are accepting God unconditionally. When we accept God unconditionally, then we are, as it will, turning ourselves over to receiving and experiencing the process of divine law. Of course, if we don't accept God, we still go through divine justice. Now, Jesus summarized it in this way, but actually the phrase, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might, was not only stated by Jesus, but it's also in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the fifth book in the Hebrew Bible. There's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and finally Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament in the Christian Bible is essentially the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. There are more books than just the first 5, of course, but the first 5 books are what is called the Torah in Judaism. And this phrase that Jesus cites is straight out of Deuteronomy. It's near the very beginning of Deuteronomy. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself is a logical follow-up to the first point, to the first, if you will, commandment. If we love everything God created, then it follows we would naturally love our neighbors ourselves. And of course, this is something that we human beings struggle with a great deal, but nevertheless, it is essential when we try to be more in harmony with not only divine law, but then also through the process of divine justice. Now, when one thinks about divine justice, if it's an essentially cause and effect, whatever we've done in the present or in the past, we live with the consequences. Is divine justice perhaps in being at times punitive? Is it really being vindictive? Well, the word punishment gets used a lot in the book Heaven and Hell. Again, the 4th book in the Spiritist codification. It gets used a lot, and I think sometimes people are tempted to kind of mix the idea of punishment with vindictiveness. But divine justice is really separating out the punishment or the vindictiveness out of punishment. You could put it this way. Divine justice is really distilling vindictiveness out of punishment. Now, why do I say that? Because when human beings hold one another accountable. If a person who committed a crime is going to be punished, in quotes, there are times when that punishment is done with a great deal of vindictiveness. It is an act of revenge. It is done with cruelty, malice, etc. There's plenty of examples in human history as well as the present where that occurs. But when we go through the consequences via divine justice, it is rather the boundaries that God has set up, and God is not being vindictive. It is merely a consequence of something we've gone through. So divine justice is, again, really about consequences. The consequences we go through can be positive, they can be negative, they can be a complex mixture of the two. There's lots of nuances to the kinds of consequences we go through. They're usually some kind of net effect that's related to our actions, what we do, what we failed to do. Then there's the intentions we had. There's the level of awareness we had in what we do. Were we truly ignorant when we did something, or were we quite aware of what we were doing and did it anyways? There's a lot of possibilities in this. And then to add to it, then there's what we do if we acknowledge or realize we did make errors. Do we try to make up? Do we make amends? Do we make reparations in some way, or do we avoid them? And so forth. At times, consequences might feel like they're unfair. God is punishing me. And the implication can be, I don't deserve to be punished. God is not being fair. But here's the thing, and this can be difficult for people to perhaps accept at times. Since Spiritism stresses that we are immortal spirits who come back to Earth via reincarnation, we're here for our spiritual progress. As we go through this process, we have a limited vision. We have, as it were, like the horse with the blinders on. And as a result of that, when we're here living this current life on this earth, there's a lot about our history we're just not aware of. So when we go through a consequence, a trial and an expiation, we may not fully understand why it's happening, but there can be an underlying purpose to it that we're not fully cognizant of. By the way, very quickly, when I say trial and expiation, those can be a blend of consequences. A trial is more of a lesson, something we go through that can be at times challenging, perhaps very challenging, but if we get through the trial, it's a lesson that we've learned. It can help us. And expiation is more of an obligation, but trials and expiations can tend to be a mix of the two. There's a little bit of overlap in both of those. Really, divine justice, the process of divine justice, going through action and reaction and so forth, it gives us a new opportunity. It allows us to redeem ourselves and correct our past mistakes. The book Heaven and Hell makes a very essential point in it, which is it flatly rejects the idea of eternal punishment. The book Heaven and Hell, fourth book in the Spiritist codification, is stressing God is not a sadist. There's always an opportunity to make amends eventually. Maybe we go through a difficulty for a while, a consequence that's not so pleasant, but we will have a chance to redeem ourselves, as it were. In other words, we get to make up for our past mistakes. We have a chance to do things over again. Speaking of the Hebrew Bible and speaking of Judaism very quickly, in Yom Kippur, the high holiday, the most important holiday of the year, which is about the Day of Atonement, one phrase that's in there, and I think this is very much a concept in Christianity too, is that it is not the death of sinners that God wants. So once again, as Heaven and Hell emphasizes, God is not out to punish us forever and ever and ever. There's always a chance to correct our past mistakes. Now, I want to focus on an example of some of the ways in which divine justice can occur. And it can happen through some rather complex and nuanced ways. The book Heaven and Hell, in the second part of the book, has testimony from many, many different spirits who are in different states of being on the other side. Some are happy, some are unhappy, some are suffering, some have been suicides, and so forth. But what they all have in common is they're revealing different ways in which divine justice can occur, depending upon the situation of a particular spirit. So I want to focus on the spirit of Antoine Bell. Antoine Bell was a spirit in his last incarnation. He appears in the Parisian Spiritist Society in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. In other words, to Allan Kardec and his colleagues. And what happened was through a mediumistic meeting, Antoine Bell appeared. Why did this happen? Well, Antoine Bell was a Canadian banker, somewhere in Canada, we can assume, who committed suicide in the year 1865. There was a friend of Bell's, a pharmacist, who knew Bell for about 20 years, and he wrote a letter to Allan Kardec, and he explained to Allan Kardec what happened to Antoine Bell, because he wants Kardec and his colleagues at the Parisian Spiritist Society to pray for Antoine Bell, see if maybe they can help him. What this pharmacist friend explains is that Antoine Bell was a banker, law-abiding citizen, had a wife, had children, was, a decent person. But near the end of his life, he started having these rather strange hallucinations. It sort of came out of nowhere, but Antoine Bell was convinced that he had purchased poison at his friend's pharmacy to poison somebody. But his friend, the pharmacist, said this never happened. It was a hallucination. Meanwhile, Bell felt like he had a spiritual presence around him, and he didn't quite understand why. And then his family started to get worried about Antoine Bell because he would go to the bank and start working the graveyard shift. He would start at 4 in the afternoon and work until 9 a.m. the next day. And in doing so, he worked very meticulously. He was an honest banker. We're told he never made a mistake, which sounds a little obsessive compulsive. And he was behaving in this rather bizarre way, and then finally he takes his own life. We don't know exactly how. Perhaps he poisoned himself, but whatever he did, he commits suicide. So his pharmacist friend asks Allan Kardec and their colleagues if maybe they can help Bell. Well, through a mediumistic meeting, Bell appears. And at first, Bell's attitude is a little defensive. It's like, well, what do you want with me? But then they reassure him they're there to help him. And very interestingly, Bell is quite willing to tell them as much as he knows and tell them everything. What he explains, because he now understands why he committed suicide. He didn't when he was alive. And he was evoked not too long after his suicide. What Bell understood was that in a previous life, before he was a Canadian banker of the 19th century, in a prior life, long time ago, he lived in the Mediterranean. He was a young man, very much in love with a beautiful young woman, and she loved him back. They wanted to get married, but her family wouldn't allow it. Why? Because Antoine Bell was poor, she was wealthy, and her father wanted her to marry the son of a merchant who was a wealthy merchant. So it was an arranged marriage. Bell was absolutely devastated. Bell wanted to commit suicide, but before he committed suicide, he was going to get his revenge on this other young man, this son of a merchant, who was going to have the woman that he loved. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. But Bell found violence appalling. He abhorred violence. So what does he do? He buys poison. And then he serendipitously, or finds a way to, he secretly slips the poison to the young man and kills him. Now, Bell has gotten rid of this person, but then Antoine Bell starts to feel guilty about what he did. And what he says in the mediumistic meeting, because he now has more awareness of what happened, was he said that he wound up paying the price for murdering the merchant's son with poison. He said, "I'm ashamed to admit that hope once arose once again in my heart. I wanted to enjoy the prize of my crime." He was hoping that maybe he could run off with the woman that he loved so much and they would be happily married and so forth. Now, realistically, you could imagine that her family never would have tolerated that. But then what happens is he says, "However, my remorse betrayed me and I expiated my moment of madness via the ultimate punishment. I was hanged for it." We don't know what happened exactly, but it sounds like he felt enough remorse that somebody figured out he was guilty of actually poisoning the young man. Sometimes when criminals commit a crime, they really want to get caught, consciously or unconsciously. It would look as though Bell, in this moment, felt enough guilt that he felt like he didn't deserve to be with the woman of his dreams, even if that was realistic. He was obviously not being rational in this moment. Now, you could say also, perhaps unconsciously, he wanted to commit suicide anyways. But what happened was he paid for his crime via capital punishment. Now, in a way, in terms of divine justice, that was probably better, because in the book Heaven and Hell, there are examples of, say, murderers who never got caught. And then what happened was, when they crossed over to the other side, they were in the presence of their victim over and over and over and over again. And they really suffered a lot because they were constantly being reminded of what they did. Bell went through a similar process. What he points out was that he felt a lingering torment. And I'll explain how lingering works here. What he says in the mediumistic meeting was that in his current life, as a Canadian banker in the middle of the 19th century, he was good. He was an honest person. But when he was in the spirit world, he had been a murderer. He had been he was hanged for his crime, but he was still in the presence of the person that he murdered for some time. That was a part of an expiatory experience he had as a spirit. But finally, as he points out, he was delivered from him after many years of repentance and praying. I then began my last existence, which I lived peacefully, meekfully. In other words, in the spirit world, Antoine Bell acknowledged that he did wrong, took some responsibility for it, prayed, asked for help, and although he had to live with the presence of the person he murdered, he eventually was disconnected, if you will, energetically from that spirit. So he was then, as he says, delivered. Then he had a chance to come back. And as a Canadian banker in the 19th century, he's law-abiding. He marries. He has children. He's able to lead a more successful life. He could have lived to old age. But then he said he felt a lingering torment. He starts to feel this guilt that sort of comes out of nowhere. Now, what happens is that I mentioned before that Antoine Bell felt like he had the presence of someone around him. And he became kind of obsessive compulsive about this poison There was something about the act of poisoning, purchasing poison from the pharmacist, which never actually happened. He was, in other words, experiencing the residue, emotionally speaking, the residue of a crime he'd committed in a previous life. And what that meant was that in this life as a Canadian banker, it came back to haunt him. Now, he felt the presence of another spirit. Why? At the time he was still alive before he committed suicide, he didn't understand. But then what happened was that as he, just before his suicide, he felt this real strong compulsion to take his own life. That's because he had spiritual company with him. He had an obsessor spirit. An obsessor spirit was trying to convince him to commit suicide. And who was the spirit? The father of the young man he poisoned. The father didn't forgive Antoine Bell for killing his son, and he was going to punish him if he could. Now, in terms of divine justice, the father would have to answer for that. But what also happens here is that Bell realized that he had this weakness about him. He felt the compulsion to commit suicide. He felt this guilt, a lingering guilt, which was actually realistically completely misplaced. It's a little bit like when Jesus said to the woman accused of stoning after there was nobody left to stone her, because he confronted everybody and said, okay, let the first one who's never sinned cast the first stone. And of course, everybody sinned, so they all left one by one. When the woman is alone with Jesus, Jesus said, who accuses you? She said, no one, my Lord. And he says, neither do I. Go and sin no more. In other words, what he said to her is, don't repeat. If you made a mistake, don't do it again. But I think also the deeper meaning of that message, and this is mentioned in the book Our Daily Bread, is don't linger in guilt after it's one thing to feel, you need to take responsibility for something we've done. But if we just wallow in guilt in perpetuity, then we're actually putting ourselves in a big trap. So Antoine Bell hadn't quite worked out the guilt. And so he was suffering from that. And that's what he meant by an innate weakness of his former wrong. It remained a part of him, but it was latent. He wasn't fully conscious of what was going on. So when Bell takes his life as a, honest, law-abiding 19th century Canadian banker, he is taking on this guilt for something that was not part of his realistic reality at the moment. Now, in terms of divine justice, he will have to answer for having committed suicide, but it's not the same as if he had just committed suicide for and with on his own efforts. In other words, Bell had a weakness. Obsession is when we have a moral flaw within us and a spirit's trying to exploit that moral flaw, and then we succumb to it. That's when obsession becomes almost subjugation. And what happened here is that because that occurred, Bell was responsible for his suicide, but there were some mitigating circumstances here. He wasn't completely responsible in the same way that if he had just done this on his own accord. He had spiritual company trying to manipulate him. Therefore, the father of the murdered son, who couldn't forgive Bell, is going to answer for his role in trying to manipulate Bell and succeeding in manipulating Bell to committing suicide. Now, as I mentioned before, the pharmacist, the friend of Antoine Bell, asked Allan Kardec and his associates at the Parisian Spiritist Society to pray for Bell. And they do that during the mediumistic meeting with Bell, and Bell appreciates it. Bell was doing prayers before in different ways. So he had enough spiritual awareness to try to pray and help himself this way. But how did it help him? Well, another interesting thing happens in the case of Antoine Bell, which is during the mediumistic meeting, the spirit guide of the medium who gave passivity to Bell points out that Bell made promises to resist the temptation to commit suicide in between the time that he had lived as a young man in the Mediterranean long ago and before he came back and became a 19th century Canadian banker. The point is, he had the trial, if you will, of resisting suicide. And he may have promised, it sounds like he promised that he would try to resist committing suicide. But the spirit guide of Antoine Bell's medium points out that God is not content with mere promises. Actions are required to prove the commitment to return to the upright path. In other words, what happened is that Bell probably, as a spirit, before he incarnated, knew he had to resist committing suicide, and it didn't succeed. The obsessor, the father of the young man he murdered, as a spirit obsessor, was allowed to obsess Bell. He wasn't thwarted, and unfortunately, Bell didn't have knowledge of spiritism, or really psychology wasn't a science at this point in this time period. So Antoine Bell didn't have enough consciousness to know how to resist this spiritual company that he had, for whatever reason. And as a result of that, he succumbed and he gave in to committing suicide. Antoine Bell now realizes, having committed suicide as a Canadian banker in the middle of the 19th century, that he'll have to go through this trial again. In his next incarnation, he will need to resist committing suicide. Sometimes a spirit of someone who's committed suicide will have that test more than once. So, and we don't know what happened to Antoine Bell after this this testimony during the mediumistic meeting. But what we do know is that it's very likely that in his next incarnation, he would have this trial, this test again, to not commit suicide. This is a very complicated example of the different ways in which divine justice was able to work. Now, again, when we're ignorant about divine justice itself and we do something, in the case of Antoine Bell, he didn't realize that if he committed suicide, it would be worse for him than if he managed to hang in there. There are consequences to committing suicide, for instance. But more importantly, when we think about divine justice, whatever consequence we're going through, it also provides more opportunities. And there's some more insight about this concept, again, through the spirit guide of the medium who gave passivity to Antoine Bell, because the spirit guide commented after Antoine Bell's passivity. This spirit guide of Antoine Bell's medium points out that all existences are in solidarity with one another, that divine justice and goodness are displayed in people's ability to gradually evolve without ever depriving them of redemption from their wrongs, that wrongdoers are punished by their own wrongs, and that punishment, rather than the vengeance of God, is the means employed to enable them to progress. So, very likely we're going to make the same mistake more than once, but even when we do that, we will get another chance. That's really the underlying message here. There's always an opportunity to try to make amends for our mistakes. And again, from one existence to the next, they're in solidarity with one another, because if I made a mistake in a prior life and I'm now in this life and I'm living with the consequences of that mistake, I still have the opportunity in this life to somehow do better and dissolve the consequences of the past mistake, which helps me to grow spiritually. Now, I gave, through Antoine Bell, a rather complex example of the ways in which divine justice can work. And generally speaking, they were more troubling consequences. But the other thing I want to talk about is Antoine Bell, much to his credit, started to take responsibility, even unconsciously after murdering the young man, which was clearly wrong. He unconsciously, he felt guilty, and probably, it sounds like unconsciously or consciously, it's unclear. He betrayed himself and he got caught and he answered for the crime. In an indirect way, he took some personal responsibility. As a spirit, looking back on his last life as a Canadian banker who committed suicide, he realizes, okay, I have to go back in a new incarnation and try not to commit suicide. Therefore, he's taking responsibility. So, divine justice and personal responsibility are very connected, and there's a very important bond between these two acts. So let's focus for a little more on what we mean by personal responsibility. By personal responsibility, we can ask a couple of basic questions about how do we understand what is my responsibility? Well, I could ask, what do I have at stake in this life, this spiritual journey that I'm on? And also, what is my side of the equation of divine justice? In other words, if there is this thing called divine justice, what am I expected to do? Well, before we get into answering that or providing a suggestion for that, I'm going to ask a couple of other questions. I think this next question is essential because it's really connected to when one thinks about what Spiritism stresses. It's not only Spiritism, but Spiritism does talk a lot about the influence of divine justice, action and reaction, cause and effect. There are some additional questions we can ask. Do I believe in God? If I believe in God, then I believe that divine providence exists. I believe in divine justice, divine law, etc. I believe that God reigns supreme in my existence. And do I believe that I have an immortal spirit that will continue after this life and is subject to divine justice via the process of reincarnation, which is intended for my spiritual progress through all the different choices I make or fail to make, etc. I point these out because if somebody does not believe in this, if somebody is very much an atheist or or a materialist, then everything we've been talking about in this presentation won't make any sense anyway. In order for us to really appreciate what our personal responsibility is, it will help us if we believe in God and we believe we're immortal spirits. But I also want to make very clear, as I'm talking to you, dear listener, it is not my responsibility to convince you to believe in God or to believe that you have or are an immortal spirit. You may believe that already, but if you don't, it's up to you to decide for yourself if you believe in that. Whether we believe in God or don't believe in God, or believe we have an immortal spirit or don't have an immortal spirit, every single one of us has to find our own way in coping with that question. Now, many people, they believe in God, they accept we're immortal spirits. But if somebody's unsure about this or maybe even rejects it, if that's ever to change in the future, that has to be done individually. It's not up to, I can say X, Y, and Z, but it's not up to me to try to convince somebody. We have to find our own way through this process. So, but let's assume for a moment that we do believe in God and we do believe we're immortal spirits and that we're subject to divine justice. Then let's go back to this question. What do I have at stake? Answer: everything. Everything I do completely and totally matters, because everything I do is subject to cause and effect. That's part of what it means to believe in God's laws, to believe in divine justice, that divine justice is real. There's another section to the book Heaven and Hell called the Penal Code of the Future Life. And it says this, and I'll read it to you. Since God's justice is infinite, good and evil are strictly taken into account. If there's not one evil act, one evil thought that does not bring fatal consequences, neither is there one single meritorious act, one good movement of the soul, or the smallest merit that will be lost, even for the most perverse individuals, because it indicates that progress has begun. This is a very positive statement. God's justice is infinite. If we made a mistake today, there's going to be a tomorrow. We can do better tomorrow than we did today. There's always an opportunity. And even if we make a little bit of progress, that in itself is a victory, especially for someone who has got a lot of flaws, as it says here, the most perverse individual. If they make some effort towards the good, then that is a way of it's a beginning and it is an opening. So when we think about personal responsibility, the second question raised, what is my side of the equation of divine justice? It's kind of similar to the first answer. Everything I can do that is within my power. In other words, what can I do now to try to work on behalf of the good, to try to understand what I need to do in general? So here's some more reflections on that. What can I do that's within my power? Well, before we get to that, we are all equal before God. What does that mean? I mentioned before, for any of this to make sense, do I believe in God? Do I believe I'm an immortal spirit that is subject to divine justice that comes from God? If that statement is true, it's true for everybody on the planet, period. So we are all equal before God in this way, but we're all equal before God in many other ways. For instance, all of us, every single one of us, has the ability to learn and expand consciousness. Again, as immortal spirits, sometimes we progress quickly, sometimes we stay where we are for quite a while, but we all have this ability to learn and expand consciousness. And the consequences we face as a result of our actions, they match the level of our consciousness. Did I know what I was doing? Did I not know what I was doing? As we evolve and mature, in other words, as our intelligence increases, and as our intelligence increases, our morality will start to increase as well, then we develop more responsibility. And as we accept more responsibility, then we have to accept the consequences. When we commit an act and we know exactly what we're doing, I mentioned this before, when we commit an act and we know exactly what we're doing, and we do it anyways, the consequences are going to be stronger, more severe, than if we really were truly ignorant. Antoine Bell was kind of a mix in that field. He had some spiritual awareness. I think he knew that killing the young man was not right, but at the same time, he was madly in love with this woman. You could question if he really understood what love was, but nevertheless, he was compulsive about this, and his judgment was clouded. So he was responsible, but there are nuances to his responsible. In terms of human law, he was punished via capital punishment. But in God's eyes, it's more nuanced than that. When we don't accept consequences, or if we make a mistake, then we need to try again. And Antoine Bell is a good example of that. Now, I've been talking about divine law mainly through the example of Antoine Bell. That can be rather complicated and nuanced, and there was a lot of things that were not so great, but still positive in the long run. But I want to give another example of how divine justice can have very positive consequences. This is an example through a person named Mr. Sampson. Mr. Sampson was an individual who lived in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. He was a participant at the Parisian Spiritist Society. He completely embraced Spiritism, believed in God, had a very sincere and devoted faith in God, believed in the future, etc. Mr. Sampson, in the last year of his life, was very ill, and he died on April 21st, 1862. I mention that date because just before he died, or as he was nearing the end of his life, because he was very, very sick, he wrote a letter to Allan Kardec and told him of his situation. And he asked Allan Kardec, can you please try to evoke me as soon as possible after I disincarnate? He goes on to say that, I wasn't a very active participant in the Parisian Spiritist Society, and I feel badly about that. So I'd like to make up. I would like to help you guys to further your knowledge. So can you please evoke me as soon as possible? Meanwhile, Mr. Sampson was making a lot of effort to pray, to ask God for help, to be able to have as lucid a transition from his life on earth as a very ill person to whatever would happen in the spirit world. Well, what happens is this. Again, he died on April 21st, 1862. 2 days later, April 23rd, 1862, Allan Kardec and his associates go to the morgue where Mr. Sampson's body is being held and is going to be buried in a couple of hours. They evoke his spirit at the mortuary. And they're quite pleased that A, they were able to evoke Mr. Sampson, and B, he actually gave them a lot of very useful information. He was quite happy to have been evoked. He actually had a decent amount of lucidity for somebody who had only disincarnated 48 hours before. And he started to describe the moments of his transition. And Allan Kardec and his colleagues were quite pleased that he had been able to witness his own death and rebirth, and that this was in itself rather unusual. A lot of times when we cross over from this world into the next, there's confusion, there's a period of uncertainty as to what's going on. But Mr. Sampson actually pulled out of that pretty quickly, and that was a testimony to the evolution of his spirit. What Mr. Sampson says is, I'll read this to you. My transition from earth life to the spirit life might have made everything incomprehensible at first, because we sometimes remain many days without recovering our lucidity. He understood that before. Then he says, but before dying, I prayed to God, asking him to allow me to speak to those whom I wish well. And he heard me. So Mr. Sampson was described in the book Heaven and Hell as being a happy spirit, because he had some awareness via Spiritism, his knowledge of Spiritism, that helped him to understand what could happen. And he prepared. He knew he was going to die. He was very sick. It was very unpleasant. He was suffering a lot, but he nevertheless believed that there was, I think you could say that he understood there was a reason for why he was suffering in this way, and that things would be better in the future if he was worthy. And he understood if he was worthy. So he prayed to God, and he felt that God heard him. He actually gained his lucidity within 8 hours after he disincarnated. So we're told. He says, God, I repeat, has given me the proof of his goodness. He deemed me more worthy than I actually am, and could never thank him as I should. Now, Mr. Sampson is being humble here. He felt like maybe he didn't deserve what actually happened to him. He turned out pretty well. But, what he says, though, is not contradicted. It turns out that Allan Kardec and his colleagues thought very highly of Mr. Sampson. even though he felt guilty about not participating more in the Parisian Spiritist Society. I think Kardec and his colleagues understood the man was sick after all. And, there's no reason for us to believe that he wasn't a decent, honest, upstanding person whose faith was genuine. Now, another thing that Samson reports is when just as he's disincarnating, he said that his spirit sight started to go dark. And then he was in a state of darkness for just a little bit, but then it's like it's like he went through a dark tube in which he couldn't see anything, and then he came out and suddenly he saw things more clearly. Or maybe it's like walking into a dark room and then walking out of the dark room. But what he says was that after that process ended, it didn't take too long. He kind of accepted it, went with it, didn't feel physical pain at this point. And then he says, I no longer saw, I foresaw. In other words, and then he elaborates, my entire life unfolded within my memory and my last remembrance. My dying request was to be able to communicate with you. So it's like he blanked out for a moment upon dying, but then he came out of it pretty quickly. And he began to realize, wow, I'm not in pain. He was thrilled by that. And his spiritual sight expanded. When he says, I no longer saw, I foresaw, he was no longer seeing with his physical eyes. When he crossed over, his sight expanded, his vision expanded. Spirits don't see with their physical eyes anymore because they don't have physical eyes. So he began to be able to see his really a little bit more of his overall spiritual journey. Now, later, Mr. Samson gets buried a couple of hours after that time he's evoked in the mortuary. And he actually knew in advance what message was going to be conveyed on his behalf during his funeral service, because Mr. Samson had some people who were rather skeptical about all this afterlife stuff and this spiritism stuff and everything. But what he said was, his message to people, fellow family members, is, may you no longer fear death, my friends. It is only another step for you if you have known how to live well. It is full of happiness if you have worthily deserved it and have completed your trials well. So Mr. Samson felt like he was trying to do the best he can, and he was happy to report that he felt like he was in a better place than he was before. He also mentioned that the physical suffering he went through, and it was quite intense, actually helped him spiritually, that he felt like, we don't know the details of that and the particulars of what exactly was going on there. But what he reports is that he felt like it served a purpose. And generally speaking, in a second evocation, a little later, when Mr. Samson is even more lucid, even in a better place, more comfortable, doesn't feel physical pain anymore the way he was when he was alive. He's encouraging it to a great deal. He says, I repeat, courage and goodwill. Do not assign more than a mediocre value to earthly possessions, and you will be rewarded. I don't think he's saying that earthly possessions are bad or the material is bad. That's not really the message that Spiritism is making about the material world. Rather, the material world is temporary. It is a tool. We learn a great deal by being in this physical world of ours. So make the most of that, but at the same time, be ready to let it go when the time is right. And then he adds, one cannot enjoy a lot of things without depriving others of their well-being. That's a caution about being greedy, concentrating wealth, and things like that. If one is living in some way at the expense of others, they should be careful, because they can be preparing, they may be setting themselves up for a big consequence later on. He says, at the end, may the earth lie lightly upon me. So again, he realizes that he's an immortal spirit. His time here on earth is a big deal. It's a lot to go through. It consumes our attention, our energy, and everything, but it's also just a little moment in the overall journey. To begin to wrap up, some final thoughts about divine justice and personal responsibility. That divine justice reveals itself more clearly to spirits as they evolve. Mr. Sampson, for instance, began to really appreciate and understand how divine justice can work. Antoine Bell is beginning to understand, but isn't fully there yet. But an important point about divine justice, to kind of repeat something I alluded to before, it's different from human justice because divine justice takes the individual into account. Also, human justice may be fair in how it's applied, but it may be very unfair in how it's applied. It can be subject to political whims, favoritism, people being falsely accused, etc. But the underlying premise of divine justice is that God doesn't make mistakes. God knows us better than we know ourselves. And therefore, whatever we go through, it's fair. But also, whatever consequences we go through, whether we think they're fair, unfair, etc., they are a wake-up call. Whatever consequences we experience, helping to develop our consciousness, go, okay, now I understand what I need to do. So Antoine Bell finally realized, all right, I need to go back and not commit suicide. Now that's a big deal for him. It's a big deal for anybody who has that temptation. And if one develops more awareness that I can resist that urge, that's a major victory. Through God, divine justice and personal responsibility restores harmony and balance within humanity, one spirit at a time. Because the way in which we experience divine justice and personal responsibility is very individual and unique to every one of us. But it's a journey each and every one of us has to go through. So it's not, I can't, somehow influence somebody else's pathway of divine justice and personal responsibility. I can only take care of my own. However, of course, we influence one another all the time. We help one another all the time. That's important, and we should do that. That's an example of charity at work, which is part of divine justice. But in terms of the actual process of what any of us go through individually, it's up to us to pilot our own ship, so to speak. To each according, these are quotes from Heaven and Hell, by the way, to each according to his or her deeds in heaven as well as on earth, such is the law of divine justice. I think it's a wonderful way to think about it. That each of us, according to our level of awareness, according to what we're capable of at the moment, we do what we can at the moment. We're not expected to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. We only have so much awareness. We will have more awareness in the future. But right now, what can we do? There was a spirit near after the, as it were, testimony for Mr. Sampson, after he's evoked 2 times by the people, by Kardec and the people from the Parisian Spiritist Society. There's another spirit that comes in named Georges who also comments a little bit about the fact that Mr. Sampson was able to have a better understanding. He'd worked on his spirituality, and divine justice was able to help him. But there's a really nice comment about the way in which divine justice is an act of love. What Georges says is love knows no bounds. It expands throughout space, alternately giving and receiving divine consolation. The sea seems to extend infinitely beyond one's sight. Its edge on the horizon seems to meet the sky, and one's spirit is dazzled at the magnificent spectacle of those 2 immensities. It's a really nice metaphor. Then he goes on to say, Thus, love, which is deeper than the sea and more infinite than space, should bind all of you, both the living and the spirits, in one and the same communion of charity, thereby accomplishing the wonderful fusion of the ephemeral with the eternal. Really nice quote. Um, Charity is a major foundational part of divine justice at work. We're talking about emotional charity. We're talking about the ways in which, through our efforts and our intentions, um, the act of charity, whether we're charitable towards ourselves, charitable toward one another, which is part of our personal responsibility, that all of this can help in our overall, not only our spiritual journey, but the ways in which love can expand. And the message from Georges is that love just keeps going and going and going. It goes beyond any physical reality and well into the eternal. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for listening, and I hope this was useful, and may you have a blessed journey.
Thank you so very much, Peter. Really appreciate you being here with us. Such an amazing explanation of all the different aspects that were exemplified to us in this great work, right? 160 years ago, it was first published,
Yeah.
Heaven and Hell. But it's really to me, truly consolation to all of us. And I hope to all of you who are here listening to Peter that you find the same. Peter, do you want to just close with any final words, a short prayer, poetry, anything that comes to your mind before we go?
Okay. Um, I think our relationship of divine justice and personal responsibility is a very complicated subject in many ways, and it takes time to understand. And I think it's important that each of us really appreciate how every day we live is an opportunity to try to deepen our connection to this journey of divine justice and personal responsibility.
Thank
So I
you.
would like to close with a prayer.
Oh,
If you,
beautiful. Thank you. Appreciate it.
if you are able to at this moment, please close your eyes. Dear God, thank you for life. Thank you for the opportunities we are given each and every day. May we do the best to navigate the journeys we are on. May we do our best to understand where we are now, the ways in which our choices now will have a resonance into the future. May we do our best to work on behalf of the good. May we take responsibility for the mistakes we make. May we make emotional honesty the foundation of our daily lives to the best of our ability. And may we do our best to understand and deepen our relationship with and our commitment to charity in all of its ramifications. Thank you, dear God, for listening. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everyone. See you next time, next episode. Thank you so much, Peter. We'll see you
Thank you for
soon.
having me. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.